Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon to everyone. I must say that the weather has not been particularly cooperative with us. It even looks like today might not even turn out to be what we expected. A whole lot of nothing. Alas, the weather. And better be safe than sorry. Anyways, a few announcements before we get going. First, discussion post 7 grades are now available online. Great work. This, I think, was our best set of contributions, and there was a lot of work that really served to enhance the conversation on the drug war. So, pat on the back for that, and excellent job overall. Second, I want to make a brief announcement about how the last exam will work. Recall that the exam will be on April 24th. That's dead week. This will be sort of our proxy final exam, since I don't really give midterms or final exams. All of my exams are the same, as you should now have seen with the administration of Exam 1 and 2. So Exam 3 will look exactly the same. The only difference is it will have an additional 10 questions on there to accommodate for the extra credit that we've talked about throughout the semester. Those 10 extra questions will contain information that is cumulative, stuff that was on Exam 1 and 2. And you'll have an opportunity to collect an additional 5 points out of those 10 questions. So as I said, recall that the exam will be on April 24th. That's a Monday, so that's going to be about 2.5 weeks from now. Today is the 5th of April, so 2.5 weeks from now. All students will be required to sit for the exam on that day. I'm not going to administer any makeup exams. So if you want to take the exam, and it is certainly in your best interest to do so, you have to be there on April 24th to take that exam. I will not do makeups. I've administered quite a few makeups for Exam 2. I did also the same thing for Exam 1, and I had no problem with that. But Exam 3 will not. There will be no alternative makeup date. There will be an alternative assignment, however. I understand that some people, things come up in life. People get sick. People have external commitments. All that sort of falls under the realm of possibilities. For those that do have an excused absence, the alternative will be an 8 to 10 page paper. So no makeup exam. You'll instead be afforded the opportunity to type an 8 to 10 page paper on a topic that I will select. That paper will be due May 1st, so that's a week following April 24th. So you only have a week to do this. I highly suggest not missing the exam, but if you know you're going to miss the exam, if you know that on Monday the 24th you're not going to be able to make that date for whatever reason, you need to let me know now, because it is in your best interest to have the most amount of time to complete this 8 to 10 page paper. Because if you wait till April 24th and you email me that day, there's nothing I can do for you. That date is set. May 1st is when that paper will be due. So contact me in advance, or try your best to attend on that date, April 24th, for the final exam. So that's all I have for today. We're going to go ahead and try to make up some of the content that we've missed. This was not, I did not anticipate that this would happen. Again, I'll echo what I had just previously mentioned about the weather. I don't rely on Florida State to make the call, because sometimes they don't make the call, and then it turns out that they should have made a call. My intuition was based off of other bodies, other organizations that made decisions to cancel after-school activities or cancel school. There were a couple school districts in our area that suspended classes. I do this because I know we have a handful of you that commute in from distances, and so it serves us as a collective to just kind of suspend it. But I don't want to miss this content, so this is my alternative, sort of a video lecture for you to get the notes. I also realize that this format might not work for everybody. This is technically not an online class, and this is a format that a lot of online teachers have used. Myself have been in an online class where this format's been used. I realize that not everyone prefers this method, so I appreciate your patience and your due diligence on all of this. You will want to take notes. The material that I'll cover will be on the quiz. It will be on the exam. This material is not excused material. You still had readings for the week, and the testing will still cover much of this material. For those that have a hard time following this video format, I need you to email me, and I will make these lecture slides available without my narrative. Meaning you'll be able to flip through them at your own speed and take the notes. But the goal is to create or sort of emulate our experience in the classroom, which can never be truly done in a digital format. But nevertheless, here we are. So anyway, we're going to be talking about police brutality and procedure. Before we really talk about individual cases of brutality, we need to define what brutal means. So Walker says that police brutality is defined as the use of excessive physical force, verbal assault, or psychological intimidation. So what is brutal is not necessarily limited to physical acts. It could include a myriad of slurs or effronteries, the use of power-based scare tactics, and unmerited deployment of weaponry. What's important to note, though, is that brutality, despite our inclination to think that is sort of a new phenomena, is certainly not. It's been reported nationwide for decades now, and is considered a major consideration in daily police procedures. The law enforcement agencies, in other words, have an active program to avoid sources of conflict and to mitigate conflict in an effort to avoid brutal situations that could escalate and be perceived by the external party as brutal or excessive. Officers are permitted to use force. This is within the realm and within the scope of powers that are given, and it is at the law enforcement officer's discretion to execute them. So what is considered brutal or excessive is often a matter of opinion. We could make the argument that a taser is the use of excessive force, but somebody in the same respect might also suggest that a taser is the lesser of many other more lethal forms of interaction. So, in other words, the discharge of a firearm. Okay. Now, there have been many notable cases of police brutality. Of course, anyone that is privy to 24-hour news cycles, and over the last few years is well acquainted with these scenes, clashes between members of the community and officers of the law. Some notable cases that come to mind: Rodney King, Danziger Bridge, which we've talked about in the past, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown. And the list really goes on. This is just a selection of kind of case studies where we can pick them apart, we can dissect them, and as in retrospect, determine whether or not the ends and the means, which again, as I have covered in past lectures, and many of you are acquainted with, the idea that police brutality is very much tied up in this idea that the means to get to an outcome are not so as important as what the final outcome is. At least that is often the argument that is used, that's put forth. Yes, the procedure used may have not been protocol, it might not have been appropriate, but the end means, the end outcome was the desired outcome. So as long as the desired outcome is achieved, the argument can always be made that it was necessary, that there were circumstances that proved the use of police brutality to be merited. So at any rate, we have Rodney King. Just a couple details. Interaction between LAPD. 4 officers were charged with assault, but none of them were found guilty. This is one of the first major high-profile cases of police brutality in America, in large part because we got to see it in real time. This is 1991. We're kind of on the dawn. We're in the dawn of portable recording devices, portable video devices for your everyday commercial use. I mean, yes, we were making movies and such. We were able to record moving images far before 1991, but most people didn't have access to that technology in a personal way. This is really one of the first times where, the average everyday person could gain access to video recording technology. And so this was catapulted into the spotlight, and the entire connection between Rodney King and many other scandals and issues that were to manifest out of the LAPD were all connected over a 4 to 5 year period. Recall that we talked about the Rampart scandal, which was a series of events that involved officers at the Rampart unit, an anti-gang unit that was designated with controlling the flow of illicit substances and managing gang populations. So the Rodney King, the most notable outcome of the Rodney King case was following the trial, which led to multiple-day citywide rioting in response to those officers, those 4 officers being found not guilty. The Danziger Bridge case, which we have also discussed, involved unarmed civilians following Hurricane Katrina. The officers involved were off-duty, plainclothed, and these officers were eventually found guilty after a series of trials. This is still ongoing. Oscar Grant was that individual who was killed by BART. Police BART is the metropolitan transit system in the San Francisco metro area. And so the involved officer did get a sentence, relatively brief. Eric Garner, a name that should be familiar with most of us because it's within the zeitgeist of recent memory, was killed by NYPD officers in an attempt to arrest him. The officers were not convicted. Finally, Michael Brown, shot by Officer Darren Wilson. Michael Brown was really the impetus for the Black Lives Matter movement and nationwide protests as a result of Wilson being accused of his role in the shooting. Now, we talk about the cause and the effect, or the cause and the outcome of these cases, because it's very important to dissect why it is that we see things in very divergent ways. There are really two different perspectives on law enforcement and police brutality. There are members within the community, oftentimes skeptical of authority and use of force, and those within the law enforcement community and those that attempt to understand acts of brutality and label acts of brutality as isolated incidents largely as the byproduct of poor communication or an inability to resolve the situation peacefully. But there is really a great divide. It's not a political divide so much as, and not even so much an ideological divide, but really a difference in perspective. Much of the difference falls on certain categorical demographic lines, but in large part, we're looking at the same issue but in different ways. So we'll discuss that. We'll flesh that out a little bit further. But before we get to there, I do want to break down one particular incident. I did mention Rodney King. I'll give you a little bit of detail and why this matters. These details matter. In all cases of police brutality, it's really important to understand how the situation broke down. When you review trials of cases of police brutality or excessive force, there's always a very, very extensive play-by-play because there's an effort on both sides of the court, the defense and the prosecution, to paint a narrative or to create a narrative that allows their audience to really understand what it was that caused the reaction being brutality or excessive force. So, 1991, King and his friends are driving on an LA area freeway after a night of basketball and drinking. Officers pursued King after noticing speeding on the freeway. So the officer pursued King. They were speeding. King refused to pull over and pushed the chase to high speed, so that it ended up becoming a police chase. Undoubtedly, probably not the best way to handle the incident. That's one side of the argument is going to point to the escalation of events as justification for the means. So it's important to really flesh these details out. But I digress. Anyway, back to the King story. King refused to pull over. King was eventually confronted by officers who threatened him with their sidearms, and this is really where it became excessive. It wasn't the the initial pullover. It wasn't the high speed chase so much, and you can't say it wasn't the high speed chase. That certainly contributed to, in some way, to the reaction that officers, the reaction from involved officers. But the use of excessive force really comes in once he gets out of the car. Officers gagged, beat, and hit King with a series of 33 contacts, and it was, if anyone's ever seen the video, is especially violent. Now I have here watch video. For those that want to watch the video or are interested in reading an article, there is an article. If you do a simple Google search, Rodney King LA Riot Anniversary, it's a Time magazine article, and it kind of provides a play-by-play on the events, and it's in reflection to that event. So the video itself, the recorded contact, the recorded exchange, was the most damning because, of course, we don't get all of this contextual evidence. We don't have evidence to apply in context. We don't have information, visual information, a recorded visual archive, in other words, of all of the stuff that precedes the use of force. But we do have the exchange, and any scrupulous or even skeptical audience member would yield to the notion that the use of force was beyond what would be considered necessary. Charges were eventually brought against the officers, and the trial was brought to court. But after jury deliberations, all the officers were acquitted on excessive force. About 3/4 of the charges on excessive force, and then the remaining charges were civil penalties, essentially. Now, this is where the event itself turns into an extreme form of escalation. As a reaction to the trial, there were 6 days of riots in Los Angeles. 2,000 people were injured, and there were material losses nearing $1 billion. Now, I don't know about you, but those are staggering numbers. That is a disaster of monstrous proportions. And I'm not making an argument to say that that was the response that was most appropriate. I don't think that's an argument that anyone would make, but it should serve as a call to arms. In other words, among law enforcement administrators and officials to take note of excessive force, police brutality. Because there are widespread implications. And we've talked a lot about the reservoir of goodwill. That is the cooperative notion, or the cooperative exchange between people within the community and law enforcement officers. Now, sure, we could manage riots by establishing order, and law enforcement officers do. But that's not the best way to restore trust to that reservoir of goodwill. When acts of police brutality occur, that reservoir is depleted. There's a extreme lack of trust, a level of distrust. In other words, it's a reciprocal, it's a converse effect. They flip. As trust goes down, distrust goes up, obviously. And so the law enforcement officers really have to pay due diligence to this, because while your gut reaction might not be, oh, well, law enforcement officers should work with the community to resolve this issue, your gut instinct is to say, no, there shouldn't be rioting, there shouldn't be this reaction, and that's a totally fair response. But we also have to acknowledge the very real human element that goes into this exchange between those who are policed and the police, the exchange of authority. In order for authority to be effective, the community has to want to participate. They have to want to yield to fiat authority. But law enforcement officers are only powerful because we give them the power to be powerful. So there's a lot of evidence that in order for communities to move forward past these acts of excessive force, law enforcement officers and departments really have to work towards reestablishing a line of trust, because police brutality is a depletion of trust, and this seemingly apparent lack of justice is another erosion of trust. So there needs to be an effort on behalf of the criminal justice community, not just law enforcement officers, but all actors within the justice community, to attempt to restore that. It took many, many, many years, really a whole decade, for the LAPD to renew and revitalize the department's image. And throughout the 90s, they just had such a difficult time. While other departments were seemingly they were enhancing their community relations, LAPD was having a really hard time getting the community to cooperate with them, and that does no one any service, because ultimately, as we've talked about, crime is everyone's problem. It's a community problem. It's not just the problem of the police officer or your neighbor or the local. It's not contained within a neighborhood. Crime is everywhere. So it's very important to think of this from a very big picture, not individual events. So there is brutality theory. These theories, I know we talk about a lot, and they don't necessarily jump off the paper, because we don't. The way they're applied in the real world may differ a bit, but brutality theories help us frame our understanding of the way the power or sources of authority, those with power, interact with those who are those that are following the law. In other words, those that have authority and those that have authority thrust upon them. So social conflict theory is one of these theories that attempts to dissect brutality and use of excessive force among authority figures. It emerges from a Marxist theory, a Marxist legacy. They argue that police are used to enforce the status quo of inequality and to assist in efforts to exploit the powerless. And this is consistent with this notion that police, law enforcement officers, are oppressive figures towards racial minority groups, and that perceived levels of injustice are actually real. They're not just perceived; they are really truly pursued ends. It suggests, from a larger point, that the state functions as an instrument of the dominant class, the wealthy and powerful. And I mentioned this when we talked about the war on drugs. Spitzer, who was a scholar of kind of a conflict theory, talked a lot about law being designed to benefit the oligarchy, the upper class, upper echelon of society. And there was excess in the population. In other words, social junk, social dynamite. These two classes of people that were so-called surplus populations. They're in society. There's nothing we can do about them. But the best way to manage them is to create a system of laws that controls them. And so law enforcement is being an arm of government. They are essentially, the conflict theory would suggest that law enforcement officers are pawns, in other words, of the state. And they exist to apply the will of the dominant class. There's a lot of research in criminology that has actually looked at this relationship. We actually have a few scholars here at Florida State that are among the most preeminent. Ted Chirikos is one of the most preeminent scholars of sort of a conflict theory legacy that looks at the relationship between law and minority groups. And so the research does contend that majority-minority conflicts do, in some way, inform police-citizen contexts. In other words, there's an implicit racial bias in the law, and that less powerful members of our society are often subjected to the most amount of force. It's not that they are exposed to force, but that they're exposed to the highest degree of force. Another theory to kind of frame our discussion is symbolic interactionism. This is a micro-level theory that really emphasizes meaning and significant influences in the socialization process. Law enforcement, we've talked about this in class, law enforcement is not unlike a lot of other things that surround us in our everyday life. When we look at a law enforcement officer, we are receiving information. Even if we have no verbal communication, there is a tacit understanding between us and the officer. That is, there are certain symbols that we affiliate their role with, that demonstrate their place in our society. The police uniform, the police car, these are all symbols that suggest in a nonverbal way, they're nonverbal cues that this is a source of authority. This is symbolic interactionism. Our interaction is based on, our reaction is based on how we interpret these symbols. So individuals approach these interactions through role taking. That is, I am the officer, and thus I'm a representation of authority and law. When I put this uniform on, when I carry this sidearm, that means that I'm the law. I'm a physical manifestation of the law, and you, being the police, have to comply. Interactions are reciprocal. They involve two different parties, and so each party's reaction in relation to the symbols and their own appraisals of themselves determines the outcome of the situation. Now that sounds pretty arcane. That sounds like a lot of academic mumbo jumbo. But think about this, right? The reservoir of goodwill, right? This idea that people have to believe in the validity of the law in order to believe that the law is that officers of the law are justifiable in their actions. If you believe that the law itself is valid, then you believe that forms of authority that enforce it are within their purview of their expectations to enforce it. So someone who does not believe in the validity of the law, or believes it's subjectively applied, rejects the argument that you are a objective figure of authority, and so I must comply. They are going to constantly challenge the system. And this is where you get a lot. This is, again, looking at the same situation two different ways. One person will say, well, that outcome is really unfortunate, that person had to be shot by that officer, but if they would have just complied, this wouldn't have happened. And that's an argument that's often thrust upon us from one end. The other end would say, well, there has been a systematic oppression of certain groups of people for all of our history, or at least a certain number of years or decades, or whatever the frame of time is, that it becomes ingrained. It becomes a almost instinctual reaction to authority. That the relationship between certain groups of people as a collective experience, that is that people in certain groups experience things collectively, that this relationship has been going on for so long that it becomes an instinctual reaction, that people are instinctually inclined to not trust the law. So, when somebody breaks the law, they are a rule violator. That's the if they would follow the law, if they would have if they would have complied. That's their argument, that the offender is the rule violator. The other side, the one that sees the law as invalid, or sees authority, the enforcement of authority is invalid. These are the people that are generally going to have negative interaction, but previous negative interactions, previous negative experience, whether it's direct or indirect, primary, secondary, all of tertiary. They have some type of experience with the law that suggests to them that the law will not be enforced fairly or justly. One more theory that we can also frame our discussion of brutality on is control balance theory. Now, this is a pretty new. The two previous theories are theories of antiquity. In other words, they're older. Control balance theory was introduced by a scholar named Charles Tittle, and really suggests this is interesting. And it probably, if we were to make the argument that police brutality is a product of control balance, a reestablishment of balance in control and power. We'd have to do some mental gymnastics. It's a little bit of psychology, but hear me out. So Tittle suggests that the power struggles inform our understanding of police brutality, and that all people, all individuals, desire to maximize their control over others. Tittle recognized that there is a complexity of internal and external factors, but control is ultimately about opportunity. So there's sort of a Darwinian foundation within this, the argument that people are predisposed to control. We desire to control others or other situations. We want to have power. And so there's a constant struggle between power. When power is exerted upon us, we inherit a deficit of power. So we react to that deficit by trying to obtain more power. So if somebody comes against you, exerts an extreme level of power, that is, you are experiencing a deficit. And so you have to, in order to balance the amount of control in your life, have to react or pursue an opportunity that allows you to balance the situation. So in other words, the act of deviance itself, being a criminal, is a product of control balancing. So if you're a victim, for example, there's a good argument here in victimology. If you're a victim, one way to balance the violation of your control is to victimize, is to participate in a criminal enterprise. And it's no great surprise to a control balance theorist that somebody that is victimized is far more likely to participate in a criminal act. Many victims eventually become criminals, and many criminals are victims, were past victims, and continue to be victims. It's a cycle between victim and offender. They are one and the same. Most victims of homicide were themselves were themselves at some point an offender in some situation. So there's an attempt to exercise control over the situation when somebody commits crime. The total amount of control one can exercise is relative to the control one is subject to. So in other words, think of this on a continuum. If the amount of control you have is 0 to 100, right? We're going to do some math here, so I know this is going to be uncomfortable for some of you. But imagine that you have a bar. Sort of think of like The Sims, right? Anyone that's played The Sims or any of these kind of like I think, what's the other game? The other digital life format game. Well, at any rate, think of it as a gauge, right? And so the gauge can be totally full all the way up to 100, or can be completely empty to 0. When somebody has power exerted upon them, they have a deficit. They lose it. So let's say we go from 100 to 80, and so the control balance theory would argue that there is a strain or a stress that's placed on this individual, and they need to correct that. Now, some people correct it in pretty mundane ways. Some people correct it in I guess you could call them pedestrian, civilian ways, non-criminal routes. But people that, for example, are victimized oftentimes will try to make up that victimization by participating in deviant acts. So it's only the amount of control that you can exercise is only relative to the amount of control that you gave up or surrendered. So those theories are important to keep in mind, and they're really interesting because if you think about it, if you step back from it all and flesh it out and apply it to individual cases or kind of police brutality as a whole, you can see that each one of them, in some way, you could make the argument that in some way all of those theories fit neatly to some degree in explaining why brutality occurs from both ends. Why it is that law enforcement officers use excessive force. Why is it that they that this is the route that is taken in many instances, and why is it that some civilians, some potential or some suspected offenders resist or don't comply? There are many different arguments that can be fleshed out here. A couple statistics on brutality. So as of mid-2015, so let's say June or July of that year, there were 385 fatal police shootings, essentially 2 officer shootings per day, the highest in more than a decade, and that's a staggering number. But it's also equally as important to recall that incidents of police brutality are not new. This has been a recurring theme of conflict between members of the community and officers of the law. We live in a 24-hour news cycle, and so there is a tendency within our mainstream 24-hour news cycles to create illustrative narratives that are profitable, that are sexy. So I remember back in 2015, you would turn on any popular news channel, and you would be almost assaulted by the amount of imagery, this just violent imagery exchanges between people and officers of the law. Well, that has an implication. It creates, it forms a narrative. It in a sense creates a moral imperative among its viewers. People that might not be as aware or privy to that information are now becoming more aware to it. So it's important to contextualize this information and really any discussion on police brutality, any discussion on issues related to the criminal justice system within the framework of the media. Because as us, being scholars of criminal justice and criminology, we know that these things have happened and continue to happen. They're not new phenomena. But at any rate, 385 shootings mid-2015. It was the highest in more than a decade. There are some trends that we can note in many of these victims. Reports that generally come out of the academic community based on collected statistics suggest that African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed than other minorities. So that would be other racial minorities. And victims, of course, differ by age. But of those unarmed individuals, those that don't have a firearm, 40% of them are black males. 25% of those killed are thought to be mentally ill, and they're mentally ill as identified by law enforcement in the situation. From the justice component of these interactions, that is the adjudication of these cases, 98% of these cases do not involve officer indictments. And finally, we'd be remiss to really explain this and pull it apart, but there is a tendency for some people to make the argument that there are, by total number, more people, more individuals, community. Let me preface this by saying that when we talk about acts of police brutality, really, it's very hard to separate the very real racial component that's within this. There is a conversation that has to be had about how race plays into use of excessive force. It is true on paper that the number of African Americans, that is, those that are not African American, that get shot by the police is much higher. For example, those that are white male offenders, there were a total of 732 last year that were shot and killed by the police. That's a high number, and that's compared to about 381 last year of African American males. Now, those numbers are important to note because this is an argument that will be made that there isn't a racial discrepancy. But we also have to step back and think about this. We have to think about total population. We have to think about the disproportionality of excessive force. It's not that one type of shooting against one type of person is worse or better, or we can characterize it in any one particular way. They all should merit the same response. But those that are critical, that are really on the side of the discussion that talks about the importance of rooting out brutality, often also will frame it within the context of racial animus and race relations. And these two things are very much married to each other. Excessive force is, by all accounts, both anecdotal and statistically speaking, race is connected to the type of force and the degree of force. We know this. We could just look at the raw numbers. It's really hard to turn a blind eye to this. So brutality is, as I mentioned, is married to this idea that race plays some role. Now that it may be a case-by-case incident. It may be a case-by-case set of situations, which it most likely is. But we can't have a real conversation on police brutality, and we can't talk about how to reform police brutality without also talking about how we reform law enforcement culture and how we reform our response to marginalized communities and communities that have been traditionally used as scapegoats. So now that leads us into police training. How do we solve a problem like police brutality? So it's a big issue. It's a big issue. There is no one right answer. And it is true, and I will juxtapose my commentary on the inexplicable link between race and excessive force by also saying that, in large part, if we were to count up all the number of interactions between the citizenry, the wider citizenry, and law enforcement, the number of uses of excessive force is really, really small. It's really small. It's no different like when we hear about a plane crash, 150 people, they perish in a plane crash. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. But statistically speaking, that was one plane out of a million flights. So it doesn't make it for the timid flyer such as myself. It doesn't make it any better. But statistically speaking, and not even but by sheer odds, the number of interactions that could be characterized as excessive force is really, really small. Now, when they do happen, though, they are very loud. So that's why it gets so much attention, and that's why there is such an emphasis on, both from from advocacy groups and popular media. There's such a huge emphasis on trying to solve this issue. Now, it's suggested that implicit bias-oriented training is maybe a useful tactic, because the truth is if we're going to talk about police brutality, and we agree, or we yield to the argument that race enters this to some degree, then we have to have bias-oriented training. We need to be able to train our officers to recognize situations that may be characterized as sensitive, but still have the power to handle them effectively. Part of that comes in de-escalation strategies and racial reconciliation training, but a lot of it comes in the form of weapons training. Okay, it's not that our officers of the law do not deserve to be fully prepared for situations. They should be. in our discussion of the militarization of police, there is certainly an argument to be made, an argument to be had that officers should be as prepared as those potential offenders. They shouldn't be put into a situation where they are outgunned. We don't want that. We want our officers to be fully prepared to handle an interaction that may turn potentially dangerous. But a lot of this could also be solved by just simple training on how to properly use a weapon. Military grade training on weapon exchange would be one of the ways to do it. It's also been suggested that greater programming between officers and diverse members of the community may help. We talked a lot about community-oriented policing, and there was in the discussion thread, there were a couple of you that talked about Coffee with a Cop. This is a program that many departments, many cities have pursued, and it sounds really mundane, really simple, elementary, like, go to Starbucks and have a coffee with a cop. But it starts there. It's that dialogue. It's opening up channels of dialogue between sources of authority, the police, and those who are being policed. That's very important. It's especially important for certain groups of people that have traditionally had negative relationships, poor relationships with law enforcement. What I'm saying is minority communities. They benefit racial minority communities that have traditionally had negative relationships, poor relationships with officers of the law, benefit greatly from these types of programs that connect the two parties. It allows for positive interaction, and may open the door to reducing any existing biases, any misunderstandings about how the law works, or how a specific group of people operates, or how an individual operates. So it's those are things that have been suggested, but it's also important to note that there's been no evidence that this program will be effective. So this is, of course, not encouraging. We may be able to influence individual judgments and raise awareness, but there's still no way to kind of collectively root this out. So this is the futility, yes, of managing things like police brutality. It may be an issue that is foundational. It might be impossible to root out. It's like corruption and fraud in corporations and in businesses. There's really no real way to eliminate it completely, but we can raise awareness and make officers more accountable to their actions. So a lot of this comes in the form of accountability. So I talked about racial bias, and we're not going to have a separate lecture on race relations like I originally hoped to have, because of this weather and just and our missed class time. But at any rate, we're still going to talk a little bit about this. And I mentioned racial bias, but we can flesh this out. When we talk about racial bias, and we're not just talking about it in terms of use of excessive force, but minority groups and the tensions that have traditionally been observed between these groups. The racial animus between groups, between sources of authority. I won't necessarily say police officers, because this could really go in many directions. It could be police officers. It could be judges, those in the courtroom, prosecution, defense. All of even the defense itself. All of these sources of authority that serve as representations of the law. There may be there has been the argument that there's a racial animus, and it is concurrent between historical patterns of white racism or white racial dominance and black attitudes towards oppressive figures. And this is evolving. We're seeing it evolve right now, not just among the African American community, but also in other racial groups. Newly arrived immigrants is one potential group. So it's important to kind of contextualize this. Inner city African Americans and newly arriving immigrant populations have traditionally in our country been pushed in through a series of manipulations in the law, have been pushed into areas that would be characterized as socially disorganized. That is, they have characteristics that make them structurally disadvantaged. For those that have taken criminal justice theory or criminology theory, you may be familiar with this idea of social disorganization. It's a theory that comes out of the 1930s and 40s that talks about areas that have the highest crime rates can be characterized by patterns. That is, they have very high transient rates, people coming in and out of the neighborhood all the time, people moving, no stability in the community. Heterogeneity, that means people are all different and there's no unity among those, and neighbors are isolated from one another. And finally, there's structural disadvantage. So this extreme form of concentrated disadvantage creates what has been called as a lack of formal controls. That is, people that live in these areas, and I'm not making an argument that all people of minority groups experience this, but this is a pattern that has been observed, and it's for many scholars and for thinkers in the criminal justice world, this is one way to understand why why excessive force exists, why police bias exists, why there has been this persistent pattern of behavior and exchange between certain members of the community, of our larger community, and officers of the law. And what happens as a byproduct of that, which is legal cynicism. So I have the cycle here. Urban disadvantage leads to police biases. In other words, law enforcement itself, through their interactions and through repeated interactions, it kind of generates this sort of bias. One of you in the class actually had mentioned before, and I don't recall who it was, but one of you had mentioned in a discussion once that they had a relative who was a police officer, who had never considered themselves to be prejudiced in any way, and had no hang-ups against groups of people. But when they became a law enforcement officer, they were, through experience, transformed in a way, and they became biased towards certain situations, certain groups. This is talk to any law enforcement officer that works a beat, especially an urban beat, and this is a pretty uniformed experience. Many officers will echo this, that police biases are developed on the job. Most law enforcement officers don't bring their biases with them. They are developed on the job as a reaction to conditions and situations endemic to the job. And then, as a reaction to that, people on the receiving end of that biases become cynical of the law. So it's a really vicious cycle, because the pre-existing conditions that create an unpenetrable level of disparity, of poverty, a cycle of poverty that is so hard to escape, creates in some way creates crime. It's not that poverty creates crime, but there are more opportunities because there are less legitimate opportunities. The argument could be made that there are more illegitimate opportunities for crime, and so then that creates bias, and in reaction to that generates some type of cynical reaction among that community, that they don't think that law enforcement can objectively apply the law, that they can apply the law in a fair manner. So anyway, getting back to this, a lack of formal control creates a disconnect between those people living in these really socially disorganized areas and prototypical social bonds of government. So in other words, they have a general distrust of authority. And so these areas, again, are distinguished by crime, sometimes drugs, violence, illiteracy, poverty, and poor social economic costs. The dominant group holds that law enforcement, and this is the argument about talking about, is there racial bias or isn't there racial bias? The dominant group holds that law enforcement applies the law equally and fairly and responds to dissent negatively. They suggest that the law should be observed and respected. But it's important to recognize that if you're not in these cycles of urban disadvantage, oftentimes African Americans, newly arriving immigrants, other racial minority groups, and not just racial minorities, it could be really any type of minority that gets stuck in a cycle of disparity, gets pushed into these areas that are very concentrated with crime, areas that often are the most policed, have the highest degree of arrest, have the highest degree of incarceration. And so there's this cycle, this unbreakable cycle between crime, criminality, a disrespect for the law, poor relationships with law enforcement. And so this is why we see neighborhoods in urban areas persistently criminal. Law enforcement is not able to solve these problems because it's not a criminal problem. It's a systemic problem. It's a problem at a foundational level. There's no way to solve crime if our goal in the criminal justice system, if our goal should be to problematize the issue in such a way that we're all out of a job, that criminal justice no longer exists. There's no need for it to exist because crime has been solved. All crime does no longer exists. Well, part of that's unrealistic. Crime will always exist to some degree because what is considered criminal is respective to the law and what the law says is criminal. But it's curious to think that there are areas in our country, especially urban areas, that are persistently year over year increasing in the degree of violence, the number of homicides, the number of violent crimes. And yet these are oftentimes the most policed neighborhoods and with no results. No results. So when we talk about racial bias, we really need to think about also at the very bottom, structural inequality. We need to talk about the persistent disadvantage in certain communities and why it's so hard to lift people out of that. And in respect to that, how legal cynicism or distrust for authority comes into play. And incidences that enhance that legal cynicism, like police brutality. Finally, we do have a question for the day. I want you all to consider the previously discussed theories. So that is the conflict theory, these brutality theories, the conflict theory, social conflict theory, the symbolic interactionist theory, and control balance theory. Which of these three helps best frame our discussion on brutality and excessive force? And does this theory really apply in all situations uniformly? I want you to consider that going forward. This is all I have for you today on this lecture. There will be an additional lecture that I will record and will be uploaded to Blackboard right at the same time this will be made available. I would do the same as you did here, take notes, make notations as needed, and prepare your material in such a way that will allow you to succeed on the quiz and the exam. And if there are any questions, as always, feel free to contact me, email me. I am around in the office. I know very, very few of you have made an attempt to come and see me, and I know that this class isn't really the type that merits it, but I am available. I can talk with you if you have questions or concerns about your grade, and try to make myself as accessible as possible, despite some of these classes being canceled. I still want to be around in case you have a need. So, with that, enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye now.